The morning Violet Finley walked into Harlan, Texas with a hammer in one hand and a deed in the other. Every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared, because women in 1882 did not carry hammers unless they intended to use them. She was 26 years old, recently widowed, and she had not slept more than 3 hours in any given night for the past 2 weeks. The dark circles beneath her eyes did nothing to diminish the sharp green of her gaze, and the black dress she wore, practical and plain, was already dusty at the hem from the 3-mile walk she had made from the edge of her property into town. Her dark auburn hair was pinned back with a severity that matched her expression, and the set of her jaw was the kind that made men think twice before opening their mouths, and then open them anyway because men in 1882 were still learning certain lessons. The deed was real. She had found it folded in the bottom of Thomas Finley's old boot box, tucked beneath a leather-bound Bible he had not opened since their wedding day, and $2 silver he had been saving for reasons she had never learned. The deed bore his signature, and hers, and the signature of a notary in Abilene named Harold Peck, who had pressed his seal into the paper with such force that the indentation was still crisp even after 4 years. The land was theirs, hers now 160 acres of good grass and one reliable creek, registered under the Homestead Act of 1862, proved up and paid for in full. And yet Crawford Holt, who operated as both the land agent and the de facto authority on property disputes in Harlan County, had told her 3 days ago that the land reverted to county holding upon her husband's death, because she had no male heir and no male representative to maintain the claim. He had said it pleasantly, which had made it worse. He had offered her a fair price, which had made it even worse than that. He had smiled, which had settled something cold and resolute in the center of her chest that had not moved since. Crawford Holt did not know about the deed in the boot box. The courthouse in Harlan was a 2-story limestone building that sat at the far end of the main street like a man who thought too highly of himself. It had a broad wooden door painted the color of dried mustard, and on either side of that door there were posts that had been used over the years for the tacking of notices, proclamations, and the occasional wanted poster. Violet had thought about this on her walk into town. She had thought about what Thomas would have said and what her mother would have said, and then she had stopped thinking about either of those things because Thomas was 3 weeks in the ground and her mother was in Missouri and neither of them was here and she was. She was halfway down the main street when she heard boots on the boardwalk beside her, keeping pace. She did not slow down. "Ma'am," said a voice, low and measured, not the kind that was trying to impress. "That is a significant hammer for a Tuesday." She glanced sideways and took in the man in one practice sweep, the way people who had grown up around strangers learned to do. He was perhaps 30, maybe 31, tall enough that the brim of his hat cut a line across the morning sky behind him. He had the kind of face that had been outdoors for a long time, weathered at the corners of his eyes and along the jaw, but not unkindly. He wore a plain brown coat over a work shirt, and his boots were the boots of a man who actually worked rather than the boots of a man who wanted people to think he did. His hands, she noticed, were the same way, calloused, real. "It is," she said, and kept walking. He kept walking too. "I'm not trying to involve myself in your business," he said, "but I have been in Harlan for about a week and I know the way that Courthouse tends to receive visitors, and you look like a woman with a purpose that Courthouse is not going to appreciate." "Your observation is correct on all counts," Violet said, "and yet here I am." "Here you are," he agreed. She stopped. He stopped with her, a half step behind, respectful of her pace. She turned and looked at him fully this time. He had steady brown eyes and he met her gaze without flinching, which she appreciated, and without the particular kind of softness that men sometimes affected when they wanted to manage a woman, which she appreciated more. "Do you have a reason for walking beside me, or is it a habit?" she asked. "My name is Warren Underwood," he said. "I am a cattleman by trade, passing through Harlan on my way to the Breckenridge Range. I have no stake in whatever you are about to do." He paused. But I have been watching Crawford Holt operate in this town for a week, and he is the kind of man that does not respond well to a woman walking through that door alone. Violet considered him. And he responds better to a woman with a stranger beside her. He responds better to a woman who is not alone, Warren said simply. He is a coward. Most men of his particular type are. She looked at him for another long moment. The morning was already warming, and behind her she could hear the town resuming its business, horses and wheels and the distant thump of a smithy. She thought about Thomas, who had been gentle and good, and had died of a fever that had come on fast and left nothing to be done. She thought about the deed in her hand, the paper still faintly creased from its years in the boot box. She thought about 3 miles of dust and 2 sleepless weeks and Crawford Holt's pleasant smile. "You can walk beside me," she said, "but you will not speak for me." "I would not dream of it," Warren said. They walked the rest of the main street together, and if people stared before, they absolutely stared now, the widow in black with the hammer and the tall cattleman in the plain coat, moving with the quiet coordination of people who had known each other much longer than 4 minutes. Violet did not look at the people watching. She kept her eyes on the mustard-yellow door at the end of the street. The courthouse steps were 4 limestone risers, and they climbed them without pausing. The door opened into a dim entryway that smelled of old paper and tobacco, and a clerk at a small desk looked up at them with the expression of a man who had been startled mid-nap. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge of land records," Violet said. The clerk blinked at her, then at Warren, then back at her. "That would be Mr. Holt, ma'am, but he is. I am aware of Mr. Holt," she said. "I do not want to speak to Mr. Holt. I want to speak to whoever is in charge of the official county record, above Mr. Holt, if such a person exists in this building." A long silence. Warren stood slightly behind her left shoulder and said nothing, but she was aware of him the way you are aware of a wall that is standing firm behind you, not leaning on it, just knowing it is there. "That would be Judge Alderton," the clerk said slowly. "But the judge does not generally receive. Please tell Judge Alderton that Mrs. Violet Finley is here concerning the improper attempted seizure of her legally deeded homestead under the Homestead Act of 1862, and that she has documentation, and that she would prefer to resolve this matter civilly before she is compelled to resolve it otherwise." She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without decoration, at a volume that was not loud but somehow filled the room completely. The clerk stood up from his desk. 20 minutes later, Violet Finley was sitting across a wide oak table from Judge Arthur Alderton, who was 60 years old and had the kind of white mustache that seemed to make its own decisions. Crawford Holt had been summoned and now sat to the judge's left, his pleasant smile considerably less pleasant than it had been 3 days ago. He had brought a man with him who appeared to be a lawyer, or at least carried papers, and wore a jacket that suggested he wanted to be taken for one. Warren sat in a chair along the wall. He had been invited to leave politely, and had politely declined, and no one had pushed further because there was something about the way he settled into a chair that made the act of asking him again seem like more trouble than it was worth. Violet laid the deed on the table. She laid it flat, smoothed the creases with her palm, and turned it so the judge could read it without turning his head. She watched his eyes move across the document, watched his mustache shift as his expression shifted beneath it. "This is a registered deed," Judge Alderton said. "Yes," Violet said, "filed in Abilene, 4 years ago. We proved up the full 5-year requirement. My husband began the claim before our marriage, and I continued the work alongside him. The law requires continuous improvement of the land, and we fulfilled that requirement. The deed was issued. You will note the notary's seal and the date." Crawford Holt leaned forward. "Your Honor, the claim was registered in the husband's name. My name is also on this deed," Violet said, not raising her voice, not looking at Holt. "You will see it there on the second line, below my late husband's signature." The man who might have been a lawyer shuffled his papers. "Under the laws of coverture, a married woman's property rights are," "The Homestead Act," Violet said, and now she looked directly at the man, "specifically allowed women to file claims independently. The law has allowed female heads of household to hold and maintain homestead claims for 20 years. I am now the head of this household. I have a legal deed. I have a notary's seal. I have documentation of every improvement made to that land from the first year to the last." She reached into the fold of her coat and produced a second document, a handwritten accounting she had spent 3 nights compiling by lamplight, every fence post and irrigation ditch and structure catalogued with dates. "Mr. Holt told me that this land reverted to county holding." "That is not the law. That is Mr. Holt's preference." The silence in the room was the particular kind that happens when something true has been said so plainly that there is no arguing around it, only through it, and no one present was prepared to go through it. Judge Alderton looked at the deed for a long time. He looked at Violet. He looked at the accounting. He looked at Crawford Holt in a way that communicated something between the two of them that Violet did not need to hear to understand. "Mr. Holt," the judge said finally, "it appears that Mrs. Finley holds a valid deed to the property in question. I see no legal basis for county seizure." Holt's pleasant smile was gone entirely now. "Your Honor, the practical matter of a woman alone maintaining 160 acres is the woman's practical matter," Judge Alderton said, with a finality that ended the sentence and everything attached to it. They were out of the courthouse 40 minutes after they had entered it. Violet stood on the top limestone step and breathed the open air, which smelled of horse and dust and the distant sweetness of a bakery 2 doors down, and felt the tension in her chest release in a long, slow exhale. She still had the hammer. She had never needed it, but she had needed to carry it, she thought, because the carrying of it had told her something about herself that she had needed to know. She was going to be all right. Warren Underwood stood beside her on the step and said nothing for a moment, and she appreciated that too. "He is going to make trouble," Warren said eventually. "I know," Violet said. "Men like that do not accept being wrong in front of a judge without finding another way." "I know that too." She tucked the deed carefully inside her coat, close to her body. "But he will have to make it legally now. He has nothing to hang it on except spite, and spite alone does not hold up in front of Judge Alderton, apparently." Apparently. Warren looked out at the main street, where life had fully resumed, and no one was paying them any particular attention. "What do you do now?" "I walk back to my land," she said. "It is still my land." He looked at her then with those steady brown eyes, and there was something in his expression that was not pity. She would have closed herself off entirely from pity, but something more like recognition, the way a person looks at another person and sees in them something they understand from the inside. "I will walk with you," he said, "if you have no objection." She thought about objecting on principle, and then decided that principles could afford to be practical on occasion. "I have no objection," she said. They walked back through the town and out the other end where the buildings gave way to open grassland, the road narrowing to a track, and then to something that was more suggestion than road. The tall, dry grass pressing in on both sides and the sky opening up above them in the way that Texas sky does, suddenly, completely, like a door swung wide. The morning was full in earnest now, the sun climbing and the heat beginning to assert itself in the way it did in late summer, pressing down on the shoulders like something with weight. Violet told him about Thomas without fully meaning to. It began when Warren asked, carefully, how long she had held the land, and she said 4 years of proving up plus the time since, which was 3 weeks, which was how long Thomas had been gone. Warren did not say he was sorry the way most people did, with the reflexive speed that turned the words into a kind of wallpaper present, covering something not quite real. He said he was sorry, and then he let it sit, and the sitting of it felt more honest. Thomas had been a good man, she said. A farmer more than a rancher, though they had a small herd. He had loved the land with the particular intensity of a man who had grown up with nothing under his feet that was his own, and the 160 acres had meant something to him that went beyond the practical. He had died in March. the fever coming on a Wednesday and being finished with him by the following Sunday. And she had buried him at the edge of the eastern field where he had liked to stand in the mornings and look at the grass. Warren listened to all of this without filling in the silences, and by the time the roof of the farmhouse came into view over the low rise ahead of them, she had said more to this man than she had said to anyone in 3 weeks, and she was not sure whether to be unsettled by that or grateful. The farmhouse was modest by any standard and plainly built 2 rooms, a sleeping loft, a solid stone chimney that Thomas had been proud of and had every right to be. There was a vegetable garden along the south wall in various stages of production, and a small barn that needed new planking on the east side, and a chicken coop, and beyond all of that the land itself, stretching out in rolling grass toward the creek that Thomas had loved almost as much as the acres themselves. She had left it in the morning, and returning to it in the late morning with the deed still safely in her coat felt entirely different than it had 3 weeks ago or even this morning. It was hers. She had stood in a courthouse and said so, and a judge had agreed, and the paper in her coat was proof of it. The relief of this was larger than she had expected, and it moved through her in a way that made her eyes sting briefly, which she managed by looking at the east field and blinking twice. Warren stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the property with the experienced eye of a man who had spent his life reading land. "Good grass," he said. "Yes," she said. "Creek-fed year-round." Thomas said it had never gone dry in 5 years of watching it. He asked neighbors who had been here longer, and they said the same. She paused. "You know cattle country. I have spent most of my adult life in it." He turned to look at the barn. "That east wall needs work before winter. I am aware." He looked at her then with that same expression from the courthouse steps, the one that was not pity but something more honest. "Mrs. Finley, Violet," she said before she had consciously decided to. A small shift in his expression, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "Violet," he said, "I was going to say that I have no particular pressing need to reach Breckenridge before the end of the month, and I know how to put planking on a barn wall." She studied him. "You are offering to do work in exchange for what exactly?" "Room and board for a week," he said. "I can sleep in the barn, I eat simply. And at the end of the week, I will continue on to Breckenridge, and you will have a barn wall that will hold through winter." She thought about this for a long moment. She thought about propriety and what the people in Harlan would say, which was going to be unflattering regardless of what she did, so that consideration resolved itself quickly. She thought about the east wall of the barn, which was genuinely in a state that concerned her. She thought about the fact that Warren Underwood had walked into a courthouse alongside her and sat in that chair along the wall and said nothing when saying nothing was precisely the right thing, and that was a harder skill to find than most people appreciated. "You can sleep in the barn," she said, "and I will be clear that the arrangement is a practical one and nothing else." "I would expect nothing else," he said. "He went to work that afternoon." She watched him from the kitchen window more than she meant to. The way he moved around the barn with the unhurried efficiency of a man who knew exactly what each task required and applied exactly that amount of effort, no more. He had gone to his horse, a good gray gelding he had left tied outside the courthouse, calm as a statue through everything, and retrieved tools from his saddlebag with the self-contained competence of someone who traveled alone and had learned to be sufficient. He had a pry bar and a hatchet and a small hand saw, and by the time the afternoon light was slanting gold across the yard, 2 of the failing boards on the east wall were down, and he was measuring for replacements with a length of cord. Violet brought him water without making a ceremony of it, setting the tin cup on the corner post of the fence and going back inside, and when she looked again 20 minutes later the cup was empty and back on the post. She cooked a simple supper: salt pork and beans and cornbread, the food she had been making for herself since Thomas died, plain and sustaining. She set a second plate on the table and called out the door when the light was going, and Warren came in from the barn, hat off, hands washed at the pump, and sat across from her at the table she had eaten at alone for 3 weeks. It was different, having someone across the table. She had not anticipated how different it would be. Not better, exactly. It was too soon for comparisons, and she was not in the business of making them, but different. More like the shape of an ordinary life, the kind of shape that had been missing. He thanked her for the food, which Thomas had done too, and meant it, which Thomas had also done. And she noticed that she was measuring him against Thomas and made herself stop. Thomas was in the east field. Warren Underwood was a cattleman passing through for a week to fix her barn wall, and that was the entire of it. They talked while they ate. He told her about Breckenridge. There was a rancher there named Cowboy who had been trying to hire him for a year, and he had finally decided to take the work because wintering in the open was harder than it had been when he was 22. He was 30, he told her, which placed him 4 years ahead of her. He had grown up in Missouri. She told him her mother was in Missouri too, in Springfield, and he laughed a little and said small world, even in a big country, which was the truest thing anyone had said in some time. He had never been married. She did not ask why, but something in the way he said it communicated that it was not from lack of wanting. She told him she was going to try wintering the cattle herself this year. She had 12 head, modest but not nothing, and that she had already written to Thomas's cousin in Oklahoma for advice on supplemental feed, because the cousin had managed a small herd through 3 hard winters and lived to describe it. "That is sensible," Warren said. "Do you have anyone nearby who can help if a hard freeze comes and you need to move them?" "I have a neighbor named Ellis Boone about 2 miles north," she said. "He is an older man, farming mostly. He has been kind." She paused. "The people in town are less kind. They think I should sell." "People often think widows should sell," Warren said, with a dry edge that was not quite bitterness but had clearly been formed somewhere near it. "Mostly it is because there is always someone who wants to buy." "Crawford Holt," she said. "Crawford Holt," he agreed. After supper she washed the dishes and he offered to help, and she said no because there were certain economies of space in a kitchen that were not designed for 2 people, which was true, and also she needed 10 minutes of not being watched, which was also true. He went out to the porch and sat on the step with his coffee, and when she came out to sit on the other end of the step, the evening was full dark and the sky above the Texas plain was extraordinary stars in such abundance that they seemed less like individual things and more like a continuous brilliant material stretched across the darkness. "I had forgotten," he said quietly, "how it looks when there is no town light." "I have never forgotten," she said. "I watch it most nights. I could not sleep for the first week after Thomas died, and I would come out here and watch the sky because it was the only thing that felt proportionate." He looked at her. She was looking at the stars. "Proportionate to the loss," she said. "Everything else felt too small for it. The house, the rooms, the daylight. At night the sky is the right size." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a very true thing to say." She glanced at him then and found him looking at her with an expression that she did not have a name for, something open and careful and entirely real, and she looked back at the sky because it was easier. They said good night simply and without ceremony, and she went inside and listened to his footsteps cross the yard to the barn and the barn door settle. And then the silence of the property resumed around her, the crickets and the distant cattle and the creek somewhere beyond the east field. She slept better than she had in 3 weeks. In the morning she found him already at the barn wall. A lantern hung on a nail to supplement the early light, and he had sourced the replacement planking somehow, she asked. And he said he had found a lumber yard in Harlan the previous afternoon while she was setting up supper, which meant he had made the walk into town and back without mentioning it. And she did not know what to do with that piece of information, so she filed it away for later consideration. She spent the morning at her own work. The garden needed attention, and she had a letter to write to Thomas's cousin, and there were 3 fences along the south boundary that needed checking, because she had seen one of the cattle pushing at the lowest rail the day before. She checked the fences, and then she worked the garden, and through all of it she was aware of the sounds from the barn the way she was aware of weather on the horizon, as information about the condition of things. Around mid-morning, Ellis Boone came down the track from the north on his old mule, which he called Constance with an affection that Violet had always found charming in an older man. He was 64, wide as he was tall, with a white beard that looked like something a cloud had shed, and he had been the first person to come to Thomas's burial and the last to leave, and she trusted him entirely. He saw the new planking on the barn wall and the tall cattleman working on it and pulled Constance up at the fence. "Morning, Violet," he said. "Morning, Ellis," she said. He looked at Warren. Warren looked back. "This is Warren Underwood," Violet said. "He is doing some repair work in exchange for board. He is passing through to Breckenridge." Ellis looked at Warren for another moment with the evaluating gaze of a man who had been lied to enough times to know what honest looked like by contrast. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded once, the kind of nod that means more than it looks like. "Good morning," Warren said. "Morning," Ellis said. Then to Violet, "I heard you went to the courthouse yesterday." "You heard correctly. I heard Holt looked like a man who swallowed a hornet." "I would not know," she said pleasantly. "I was not looking at Mr. Holt. I was looking at Judge Alderton." Ellis broke into a slow grin that rearranged his whole face. "Good girl," he said, which he had called her since she was a bride of 22 arriving at a property she had never seen, and which she did not mind because coming from Ellis it contained nothing diminishing. "He will not leave it alone. I know. You should know he was at the general store this morning talking to Ben Marsh about easement rights on the creek access." Violet was still for a moment. "The creek is on my land." "The eastern branch is," Ellis said. "There is an argument to be made about the downstream run. Holt is not a fool, whatever else he is. He will come at you from a direction that is harder to defend." She thought about this. "He cannot claim the creek." "No, but he can make it expensive and complicated enough that you think selling is easier than fighting." Ellis shifted on Constance. "I am telling you because you need to know, and because you need a lawyer, Violet, a real one, not the man Holt brought in yesterday. There is no lawyer in Harlan." "There is one in Abilene," Ellis said. "A woman named Margaret Hale who has handled homestead disputes before. She is not cheap, but she is very good, and she does not like Crawford Holt on principle, which costs nothing extra." Violet absorbed this. "I will write to her." "You do that." Ellis looked at Warren again, a last weighing look. "You are handy with tools," he said. "I have had practice," Warren said. Ellis made a sound that was approximately approval and turned Constance back up the track north. Violet stood in the yard and turned the information about Holt over in her mind the way you turn a stone to see what is under it. She had known it would not be finished. She had known the courthouse was only one move in a longer game. But she had hoped, briefly and perhaps foolishly, that the clarity of the deed and the firmness of the judge might discourage further trouble. Warren had set down his tools during Ellis's visit and had not picked them back up, which meant he had been listening, which she did not object to because there was nothing in the conversation she needed to hide. "He is going to try to isolate you from your water," Warren said. "Yes. Do you have it documented? The creek access, the boundaries?" "The deed describes the land boundaries. The creek is within them." She paused. "But I do not have a survey. Thomas was going to have one done last spring, and then the fever came." "A survey would settle it definitively," Warren said. "A survey requires a surveyor, and surveyors cost money that I am currently directing toward a lawyer in Abilene." He looked at her steadily. "Surveying is not a complicated skill," he said. "It requires a transit level, a chain, and someone who knows how to use them." "I know how to use them." She blinked. "You know how to survey land." "I worked 2 seasons with a government land surveyor in Kansas in my early 20s, he said. "I know the basics well enough for a property boundary survey. It would not be official without a licensed surveyor's signature, but it would give you documentation to present and confirm that your deed description matches the actual land. It would also tell you exactly how much of the creek is inside your boundary, so you know precisely what you are defending." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you doing all of this?" she asked, not suspiciously, genuinely. He picked up his tools. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said, as if this were so obvious as to be barely worth stating, and went back to the barn wall. She stood in the yard a moment longer, feeling something shift inside her chest, not the grief which was still there, a permanent new geography, but something alongside it. Something small and tentative and alive, like a green shoot coming up through ground that had seemed entirely spent. She went inside to write 2 letters, one to Margaret Hale in Abilene, and one to Thomas's cousin in Oklahoma about the cattle. The week that had been arranged became 2 weeks without either of them formally negotiating the extension. The barn wall was finished by the end of the 3rd day, and then Warren looked at the fence along the south boundary that she had been worrying about and fixed 3 failing posts before she had told him about them. She had seen him walking the fence line the way a man does when he is taking stock, and the posts went up the following morning. He began the survey on the 4th day, borrowing a transit level from Ellis Boone, who turned out to own one from his own years of property work, and working the boundary lines methodically, recording measurements in a small notebook with the careful precision of a man who understood that this mattered. She followed him on the survey of the creek boundary because she wanted to see it, and because there was something about standing at the edges of her own land with someone who was taking it seriously that felt important to be present for. The creek was beautiful in the way that water is always beautiful in a dry country, insistent and alive, running clear over smooth limestone, threading between stands of cottonwood that had grown up along its banks in the years before anyone had farmed here. Thomas had loved this part of the property more than any other, and walking it with Warren felt, unexpectedly, like something other than intrusion. "The eastern branch is completely within your boundary," Warren said, checking his measurement against the deed description. "And the main channel here," he indicated a point where the water curved around a limestone shelf, "runs along your boundary line for about 40 yards before crossing it, so you have riparian rights to the water along that entire stretch. Holt has no legal ground to claim access interference." "You are certain?" "I am certain enough that I would put it in writing," he said, "and I will. The survey notes will show it clearly." She looked at the creek, at the cottonwoods, at the afternoon light coming through the leaves in that particular way that late summer light has in Texas, golden and a little sad. The way beautiful things often are when you know they are temporary. "Thomas used to stand here," she said. "In the mornings, he said the sound of it was the best way to start a day." Warren was quiet for a moment. Then, he was right. She looked at him. He was looking at the water, not at her, and there was something genuine in his expression that she had come to recognize over these 2 weeks, the way he paid attention to things, the way he was present in a place, not halfway somewhere else the way some people were. "Tell me something about yourself," she said. "Something that is not about work." He looked at her then, slightly surprised, as if the question were unusual. "What sort of thing?" "Anything. You know considerable things about me at this point. I know you are from Missouri and you can fix a barn wall and survey a property line. That is not much." He considered this with the same seriousness he gave to everything. "I read," he said finally. "I carry books when I travel. I'm currently making my way through a novel by a man named Mark Twain that I obtained in Fort Worth last month." She smiled, actually smiled, with her eyes and everything, the first real one in a long time. "I have read Twain," she said. "Which book?" "The Adventures of Tom Sawyer," he said. "I know it is considered a children's book." "It is not only a children's book," she said. "Thomas thought so too, and he read the whole thing twice." They walked back along the creek bank toward the house, the late afternoon golden around them, and they talked about books. She had a small collection that Thomas had ordered from a catalog, and Warren named titles he had read in bunkhouses and hotel rooms across 10 years of cattle work, and it turned out they had both read the same collection of Dickens, and she had opinions about it, and so did he. And the walk back to the farmhouse was the first time since Thomas died that she had talked about something entirely unrelated to grief or land or survival, and it felt like breathing after a long time of holding her breath. That evening on the porch step, sitting at their respective ends with their coffee, she thought about the fact that he was supposed to have left for Breckenridge already, and that he had not, and that neither of them had made any particular declaration about this. The arrangement had simply continued, day by day, each morning its own reason for continuing. "You should not stay because of me," she said. It came out less directly than she intended. He looked at her from his end of the step. "Is that what you think I am doing? Calloway is waiting for you in Breckenridge," she said. "You have a job there." "Calloway can wait," Warren said simply. "He has been waiting a year already." "He will wait another week." "Warren," she said, and his name in her mouth felt significant in a way she had not been prepared for. "I appreciate everything you have done. Genuinely. The barn and the survey," and she stopped. "I would not want you to feel obligated." He turned to face her fully on the step, which he had not done before in the evenings, and looked at her with an expression that was direct and careful and entirely without the evasion that most people employed when saying hard, true things. "I do not feel obligated," he said. "I feel—" He stopped, and she watched him choose his words the way he did everything, with consideration. "I feel that I came into this town on a Tuesday morning and I watched a woman walk down the street with a hammer and a deed and I recognized something. I could not have told you then what it was. I think I know now. The night air was very still. The stars were doing their enormous work overhead. It has been 3 weeks since Thomas died," she said. "I know that," he said, with the same gentleness he had used when she told him so. "I am not asking you for anything, Violet. I want to be clear about that. I am telling you something true because I think you deserve honest things, not because I expect anything from it." She looked at the stars for a long moment. "What did you recognize?" she asked finally. He was quiet for a moment. "Someone who will not be diminished," he said. "Someone who walks through things instead of around them. Someone who," he paused again, "who sees the world as it is and does not stop caring about it for that reason." She felt the sting in her eyes again, the one she had been managing for 3 weeks, and this time she let it happen because the night was dark enough and the stars were the right size, and there was something about being seen, really seen, that could undo a person who had been holding themselves together by sheer determination. "I buried my husband 3 weeks ago," she said, not crying but close. "I know," he said. "And I walked into a courthouse and a judge agreed that the land is mine and I thought I would feel triumphant, but mostly I felt." She stopped. "Alone," he said. "Yes." The silence between them was a different kind of silence than the ones before. It had something in it. Not pressure, not expectation, something more like possibility. The way the land looks in early spring before anything has come up yet, when you know something is going to grow but you cannot see it yet. "I am not going anywhere," Warren said. "Not yet. And when I do go, it will be with your knowing, not in the night while you are sleeping." She almost laughed at that he had anticipated her particular fear about it, and instead she looked at him sidelong and said, "That is a very specific thing to promise." "I am a specific person," he said. She went to bed and lay awake in the good way, not the grief way, looking at the ceiling and thinking about specific people and what it meant to be seen. In the morning there was a letter in the mail bag that Ellis Boone brought by, having ridden through town on an errand. The letter was from Crawford Holt's lawyer, the papers-carrying man from the courthouse, and it was written in the formal language of legal threat, suggesting that Mrs. Finley's use of the downstream creek easement constituted an unlawful interference with county water access rights, and that unless she came to an agreement with the county regarding same, they would be compelled to seek relief through the courts. She read it twice at the kitchen table while Warren stood by the window with his coffee. "It is exactly what Ellis said," she said. "He cannot take the land, so he is going after the water." "Can he make it stick?" Warren asked. "I do not know enough law to know," she said. "That is what Margaret Hale is for. I sent the letter to Abilene 3 days ago. I have not heard back yet." "The survey notes are ready," Warren said. "I finished them last night. They clearly document that the creek's eastern branch and the main channel riparian access are within or contiguous to your deeded boundary." She set the letter down. "I am going to have to go back to Abilene," she said, "or at least to the courthouse again." She said it without dread, but with the weight of someone who knows that a thing must be done and is calculating what it will cost. "I know," he said. "You do not have to. I know that too," he said. They went back to Harlan that afternoon, not to the courthouse but to the telegraph office, where Violet sent a message to Margaret Hale in Abilene summarizing the situation and asking for the earliest possible consultation. Warren stood beside her at the telegraph counter and said nothing, which was becoming a comfortable and familiar rhythm. On the walk back, Crawford Holt found them. He stepped out of the door of the land office as they passed, and two men came out after him, not threatening exactly, not armed beyond the ordinary, but positioned in the way that was meant to communicate that Holt was not alone. He was a large man, florid-faced, who wore a coat that was too good for the climate and smiled in the way of someone who had learned that smiling made it harder for people to object to things. "Mrs. Finley," he said pleasantly. "Mr. Holt," she said, and kept walking. "I hope you received my lawyer's correspondence," he said, stepping slightly to the side so that she would either stop or walk around him, and she walked around him without altering her pace or expression. "I received it," she said. "The water question is a legitimate one," he said from behind her now, which meant he was talking to her back, which she found satisfying. "I hope we can resolve it in a manner that is good for everyone concerned." She stopped. She turned. She looked at him with those green eyes that had given him trouble in the courthouse. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I have a survey documenting my water access rights, a lawyer in Abilene who has agreed to represent me, and a judge who has already reviewed my deed and found it valid. If you wish to pursue a water rights claim, I suggest you do so through the courts, where we will resolve it in the manner that is good for the law concerned. Good afternoon." She turned and walked. Warren, who had stood exactly where he was throughout this exchange, meeting the eyes of the two men behind Holt with the calm, unintimidated steadiness of a man who had worked cattle ranges and knew how to stand his ground without doing anything that could be called aggression, turned and walked beside her. They were half a block away before Warren said, quietly, "He looked surprised." "Men like that always are," Violet said. "They forget that a woman who has decided not to be afraid of them is a fundamentally different problem than a woman who is." He looked at her profile as they walked, and she did not look back, but she felt it, the warmth of being observed by someone who was not looking for weakness. "You are remarkable," he said, just plainly, not as a compliment designed to get something, just as a statement of observed fact. She felt heat in her face that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. "I am practical," she said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said. They walked the rest of the way in companionable silence, and it was the kind of silence that had become its own form of conversation between them, easy and undemanding and full of things neither of them had quite managed to say yet. 3 days later, a reply came from Margaret Hale in Abilene. It was brisk and confident and full of the language of someone who had won arguments before and enjoyed doing so. She confirmed that riparian rights along a deeded boundary were the property owner's rights, that the county's claim was without legal foundation, and that she would be pleased to represent Mrs. Finley, and had, in fact, already sent a preliminary letter to the county on the matter that would likely discourage any further pursuit. She charged a reasonable fee and apologized for nothing. Violet read the letter aloud to Warren at the kitchen table, and by the end of it she was smiling and he was smiling, and it was the first time they had both been smiling at the same time, and the kitchen, which was a small room, felt warmer for it. "It is over, then," Warren said. "The water claim is over," she said. "Whether Holt finds another angle," she shook her head. "I cannot spend my life worrying about what Crawford Holt might do next. I have 160 acres and 12 head of cattle and a winter coming." He watched her for a moment. "And a lawyer in Abilene." "And a lawyer in Abilene," she agreed. The letter had come on a Friday, and on Saturday morning Warren did not immediately go to any task, but sat on the porch step in the early light with his coffee in both hands and watched the east field where the dew was still heavy and the grass caught the sunrise in the way grass does, each blade a separate light. She came out with her own coffee and sat on her end of the step and watched the same field. "I should go to Breckenridge," he said. Something went still inside her. "Yes," she said. "Calloway will be expecting me before the 1st of the month. You have been here 3 weeks," she said. "Yes." The field was luminous. The creek was audible if you listened, a low, persistent voice under the sound of the morning birds. "I do not want to leave," he said. It was very quiet, very direct, the way he said everything. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "What are you saying, Warren?" He turned to look at her, and she saw in his face something that she had been watching form for 3 weeks the way you watch weather form, knowing it is coming, not knowing exactly what shape it will take. "I am saying that I came into this town for one night on the way to a job, and I have spent 3 weeks fixing your barn and surveying your land and sitting on this step watching stars, and I would rather do that than ride to Breckenridge." He paused. "I am saying that I have met a woman who walked into a courthouse with a hammer because she was prepared to nail her own deed to the door if she had to, and I cannot think of a single thing in Breckenridge that is worth more than the chance to know what comes next for that woman." She was quiet for a long time. The field was still luminous. The birds were still working. The dew was beginning to lift as the sun climbed. "My husband is 3 weeks gone," she said. "I know. And I am not," she stopped, started again. "I am not ready to say certain things." "I am not asking you to say them," he said. "I am telling you mine so you can know what is true." She thought about the courthouse. She thought about the specific quality of his silence in the chair along the wall. She thought about the way he had said Thomas was right about the creek, and the way he had stood his ground in front of Holt's men without doing anything ugly. She thought about 3 weeks of practicality that had been something else wearing the clothes of practicality, and she thought she had probably known that for at least 2 of those weeks. "Go to Breckenridge," she said. He blinked slightly. "Go to Breckenridge," she said again, "and honor your commitment to Calloway. You are not the kind of man who leaves obligations unmet. I would not want you to be." She looked at him. "And then come back." Something moved across his face, relief, warmth, something that in a lesser man would have been called joy, but in Warren Underwood was expressed as the quieting of a tension she had not quite realized he had been carrying. "You want me to come back," he said, "to be certain." "I want you to come back," she said. He exhaled slowly, the way a person does when something they have been holding onto carefully can finally rest a little. "Then I will come back," he said. "Before winter, that is a promise." She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked back at the east field, which was beautiful in the morning, and she felt something in her chest that was not replacing the grief. The grief was its own permanent country, but was growing up alongside it the way the cottonwoods grew up alongside the creek, finding the good water and reaching toward the light. "Before winter," she said. "I will hold you to that." He left the following morning. She stood in the yard and watched him go, the gray gelding picking up a comfortable road trot once they cleared the property line, and Warren did not look back, not because he was not thinking of her, but because, she thought, he was the kind of man who looked where he was going, and he knew she was behind him the same way she had known the wall was behind her in the courthouse. The weeks that followed were the most solitary of her life, and also, in a strange way, among the most purposeful. She had her land secured. She had her lawyer attentive. She had Ellis Boone 2 miles north, reliably present. She had 12 head of cattle and a garden that was producing well into fall, and a chimney that Thomas had built to last. She wrote letters to Margaret Hale confirming that Holt had made no further advances, to Thomas's cousin in Oklahoma about winter feed, to her mother in Missouri who did not understand why Violet would not simply sell and come home, and to whom Violet wrote back, gently but with finality, that home was here now. She thought about Warren more than she had expected to. Not in the anxious way that people think about things they are afraid of losing, but in the way you think about something you are anticipating, with a warmth that is quiet but consistent, present in the mornings when she did the milking and in the evenings when she sat on the step with her coffee and watched the stars do their enormous work. She got the hammer back out one afternoon and nailed a loose board on the chicken coop herself. And she thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when she had carried it into Harlan. And she thought about how different everything was now, and how much the same, and how both of those things were true at once. October came, and with it, the first cool mornings that smelled of the season turning. The cattle were fat on the summer grass, and she had arranged supplemental hay from a farm east of Harlan, delivered by a boy named Pete Haverson, who was 16, and delighted by the cattle in the way that 16-year-olds are delighted by large animals they have been trusted with. She paid him a fair wage, and he came twice a week, and the cattle were managed. November arrived, and the nights were cold enough for real fires, and she kept the chimney going from dusk to dawn the way Thomas had taught her, banking it before bed so the morning was not brutal. She had split her own firewood in October, over 3 weeks of mornings, enough to get well into winter, and she was proud of this in the straightforward way that physical work completed well earns pride. She had heard nothing from Crawford Holt since the letter from Margaret Hale. Ellis said he had seen Holt at the county offices looking sour, but he had turned his considerable energies to another property dispute on the other side of the county, which meant he had found a victim with less legal standing than Violet, which was both a relief and a discomfort that she chose not to examine too closely. On a Friday in the second week of November, she heard a horse on the track. She was in the kitchen, her hands in flour for biscuit dough, and she heard the particular rhythm of hoofbeats that she had been listening for, not consciously, but clearly, because her hands stopped and her whole body oriented toward the sound before she had made any decision to. She went to the door and wiped her hands on her apron and opened it. The gray gelding came up the track at a walk, unhurried and calm as a statue, and the man on his back had his hat pushed back slightly in the manner of someone who has just come out of the sun into a shadow and is adjusting to the change. He saw her in the doorway, and something in his face settled, the way a thing settles when it arrives where it was going. "Before winter," Warren Underwood said. "I see that," Violet said. She was aware that she was smiling and chose not to manage it. "Come in, I am making biscuits." He came in. He unsaddled the gelding and put him in the barn with hay and water, with the ease of a man who takes care of his animal before himself and always has. And then he came into the kitchen and sat at the table and accepted the coffee she poured him. And the kitchen was warm and full of the smell of biscuit dough. And they talked for 2 hours about everything that had happened since he left, her winter preparations, the cattle, Ellis's health. Margaret Hale's satisfying silence that meant Holt had backed off entirely. He told her about Breckenridge, about Calloway and his range, about the work of moving cattle south before the hard cold came down from the north. "How long are you staying?" she asked when the biscuits were in the oven and they were both at the table. "That depends on you," he said. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" He set his coffee cup down carefully. "I have been thinking about you every day since I left," he said, "and not because I had nothing else to think about. Calloway's range is a good job and interesting work, and I thought about you anyway, the way you think about something that is more important than what is in front of you." She was quiet. "I am not a man who has a great deal," he said, "in the way of property or position. I have my horse and my skills and a reputation in the cattle business that is good, which is worth something even if it does not weigh much on a scale. I'm not what most people would call a settled man." He paused. "I would like to be." Her heart was doing something remarkable. She kept her hands flat on the table. "I would like to be settled," he said, "here if you will have me, not as a hired hand and not as an arrangement of convenience, as something real." "You are asking me something," she said. "Not yet," he said. "I am telling you first what is true, because you have earned the truth before the question." She thought about Thomas, who was in the East Field and who had been good and gentle and real, and who she missed every single day. She thought about the fact that she was 26, and that the land was hers and the winter was coming, and she had managed all of it, alone, and the managing of it had taught her something about what she was. And she thought about a Tuesday morning in September when she had walked down the main street of Harlan with a hammer and a deed, and a man had fallen into step beside her and said not one word in that courthouse that was not exactly the right word, which was mostly silence. "Ask me the question, Warren," she said. He looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "Will you allow me to court you properly?" he said, "with the intention that if you find in time that you want to build something here with me, I would like very much to do that. And if you find that you do not, I will go with no hard feeling and nothing but good wishes, because you deserve those regardless." The oven was warm. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window, the November sky was deep blue, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow, and the grass was the color of honey. "Yes," she said, "I will allow that." He exhaled slowly, with the same relief she had seen on the porch step in September, and then he smiled, a real smile, full and unguarded, the first time she had seen him smile like that, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and more open and entirely wonderful. "Good," he said. He stayed. Not in the house, that was not appropriate, and neither of them proposed it, but in the barn, which he winterized properly in the first week, insulating the walls and laying down good fresh straw, making a sleeping corner that was genuinely comfortable. He had brought more of his things from wherever he had been keeping them, including a trunk with clothes and 2 boxes of books, which she examined with undisguised interest, and which led to an entire afternoon of comparative review that ended with him reading to her by the fire in the evening, a habit that became the anchor of their nights. He was useful in the way that competent men are useful, not because he took over her work, but because he added to it, filling in the gaps she had been carrying alone. He rode the south fence weekly. He managed the winter cattle feeding alongside Pete Haverson, and taught the boy things about cattle management that Pete absorbed with the dedicated attention of someone who intended to ranch her for life. He helped Ellis Boone repair a collapsed section of his own barn one bitterly cold December morning, when Ellis's age made the work genuinely dangerous to do alone. And he courted her, properly and carefully, in the manner she had allowed. He brought her small things, a book from the catalog, wildflowers in November that he had found along the creek bank where the sheltered water kept things growing late, a jar of honey from a farm east of town because he had noticed she sweetened her coffee. He asked her about Thomas without avoiding it, because he understood that Thomas was part of her and that loving her meant allowing that, and she told him stories, the good ones, the funny ones, the ones where Thomas had been ridiculous and wonderful, and Warren listened to all of them with the respect of a man who understood that love is not competitive, that what she had had before was not something he was trying to defeat or replace. Christmas came quietly, just the two of them and Ellis, who joined them for the meal, and she made a goose and a dried apple pie, and Ellis brought a jug of something he described as cider, with an expression that suggested it was not strictly cider, and the three of them sat around her table, and it felt, for the first time, like something that was going to last. In January, on a night when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made the timbers of the house contract and speak, Warren came in from checking the cattle with ice on the brim of his hat, and she made him sit by the fire and brought him coffee and sat beside him, and they were closer on the bench by the fire than they had been before, necessity and cold making things possible that propriety had been holding at arm's length, and his shoulder was solid and warm against hers. And she did not move away from it, and neither did he. He turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, and the distance between them was very small. "Violet," he said, very quietly. "Yes," she said, just as quiet. "May I?" "Yes," she said before he finished. He kissed her very gently, the way he did everything with full attention and without haste, and it was the kind of kiss that was a beginning rather than an end, warm and real, and full of the particular tenderness of two people who have been careful with each other for a long time. She pressed her forehead briefly to his afterward, and they sat in the warmth of the fire, and the house spoke its cold night language around them, And outside the wind moved over the Texas plain and the creek ran dark under its skim of ice. And she felt something settle inside her that had been displaced for a long time, coming back to its right position. Spring came to the land like a person coming home after an absence, gradually, and then all at once. The warmth returning to the soil, the grass coming up green and insistent, the cottonwoods leafing out in the pale early green that was always more beautiful than the full summer green because it was the first one, the promise of it. The cattle had wintered well. Every one of the 12 head had come through, and one of the cows had delivered a calf in late March, a fine bull calf that Pete Haverson named Biscuit, and the name stuck. Violet had written to her mother in February, a longer letter than usual, in which she had described Warren in some detail, which had caused her mother to write back immediately with a quantity of questions that demonstrated her mother was taking the matter seriously. Violet answered the questions honestly, and her mother wrote back with cautious approval, and a recipe for wedding cake that Violet had not asked for but kept. Warren asked her properly in April, on a morning when the land was at its most beautiful, and they were walking the east fence together checking the winter's work, the sunshine warm on their backs and the creek audible and joyful in the way spring water is joyful, and he stopped at the corner post and turned to her, and said what he had been building toward since November. He did not have a ring yet, that was honest, but he had spoken to the silversmith in Abilene during a trip he had made last month, ostensibly to deliver survey notes to Margaret Hale, and he described what he had asked for, which was simple and the right size because he had measured the impression her finger left in bread dough one morning when she did not notice, and he felt both clever and somewhat embarrassed about this, and she laughed, which was the best response he could have hoped for. "Yes," she said when she had finished laughing. "Warren, yes." He smiled that full, unguarded smile and put his hands on either side of her face very carefully, and kissed her the way you kiss someone when the answer is yes, which is different from all other kisses. They were married in June of 1883 in Harlan, in the courthouse, not before Judge Alderton, who had done his part already, but before the circuit minister who came through every 6 weeks and who married them on a Thursday with Ellis Boone standing as witness and Pete Haverson in the back of the room looking solemn in a clean shirt. Margaret Hale had made the trip from Abilene, which had not been required and which meant a great deal to Violet, who had come to think of the lawyer as a kind of ally in the specific way that women who have fought for things together become allies. Violet wore a dress that was not black. It was the color of the cottonwood leaves in early spring, a soft green that she had made herself over 3 weeks of evenings. And Warren, when he saw her come through the door of the courthouse, had the look of a man encountering something he had been reaching for a long time and had finally arrived at. The minister spoke the words and they said the words back. And when it was done, Ellis Boone shook Warren's hand with both of his own and kissed Violet on the forehead, with the affection of a man who had been watching over her since a young bride arrived at an unfamiliar property and needed someone to show her where the good water was. They walked out of the courthouse together, not the same door, the side door because the main door still had, affixed to its frame beside the tack holes from 100 public notices over the years, the brass nail that Violet had chosen not to use. She had kept it, the hammer and the nail both, hanging on a hook in the kitchen, because they represented something she did not want to forget, the day she had been prepared to do the hard thing herself and had found someone standing beside her. Crawford Holt had left Harlan in February, which Ellis reported with considerable satisfaction. He had overreached on the other property dispute, and the judge had not been sympathetic, and the county had found itself with a liability it did not want, and Holt had departed for parts unknown in a manner that was not quite a retreat, but was indistinguishable from one in every practical respect. The land office had a new agent now, a young man named Foster who was methodical and fair, and who had, in his first week on the job, confirmed in writing that Mrs. Finley's, Now Mrs. Underwood's deed was valid, complete, and filed correctly in every respect. The confirmation was framed and hung above the fireplace, next to a daguerreotype of Thomas that she had made in Abilene, and Warren had helped her hang both of them, which was exactly the right thing to do. He had given up the Breckenridge position without regret, and they had written to Calloway to explain, and Calloway had written back a letter of congratulations that was warm and contained no reproach, which said something good about Calloway. Warren had found work with 2 ranchers west of Harlan who needed someone who understood cattle and could ride the range reliably, and the income was steady enough, combined with what the property produced, to make the operation genuinely viable. They expanded the herd that summer, bought 6 more head from a reputable seller in Abilene at a fair price, bringing the total to 19, plus Biscuit, who was growing fast and would be a useful bull in a year. Warren built a proper cattle shelter on the north side of the property, using plans that he drew himself from memory of similar structures he had seen on the Kansas ranges, and Violet helped with the framing in the way that she helped with everything fully, without waiting to be asked. The autumn of 1883 was the kind of autumn that makes people in Texas feel generous toward the state, warm enough for long sleeves rather than coat, the sky performing its best work, the grass at the color and length that made you understand why people had fought so hard to hold land here. Violet sat on the porch step one evening in October, exactly a year after Warren had arrived or close enough to it, and when he came out with the coffee and sat beside her, not at the other end of the step but beside her, close enough that their arms touched, she thought about the year and what it contained. "I owe you something," she said. He looked at her. "You do not owe me anything." "I owe you the truth of something," she said. "I have been thinking about how to say it, and I think the simplest way is just to say it." "All right," he said. "When I walked into Harlan that Tuesday in September," she said, "with the hammer and the deed, I was not frightened. I was certain. I knew what I was going to do, and I was going to do it alone, and I had made my peace with that." She looked at the east field, which was golden in the evening. "But when you fell into step beside me, something changed. Not the certainty, I still had that, but the shape of it changed. It became," she paused, "larger, like when you open a door and the room is bigger than you expected." He was looking at her with that expression she had loved since September, the open, careful, real one. "I was not looking for anyone," she said. "I want you to know that. I was not in the market for a second chance or a new beginning or any of the things that people say to each other when they are trying to be romantic about practical situations. I was just walking to the courthouse." "I know," he said. "And then you were beside me," she said, "and you have been beside me since. And I want you to know that she stopped and then went on, "that I love you, Warren. I love you in the way that is not temporary and not a replacement for anything and not a consolation. In the way that is its own thing." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the emotion move through him like weather, visible in the way everything was visible in his face when he was not guarding it. "I love you," he said. "I loved you by the time we reached the courthouse door. I have loved you every day since." She put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch step and watched the east field go from golden to rose to the deep blue of a Texas evening, and the stars came out one by one and then all at once, the way they always did, performing their enormous patient work, and the creek ran its quiet commentary in the darkness, and the cattle moved somewhere in the distance, and the chimney began to breathe warmth into the autumn air. By early winter she knew there was going to be a child. She told him in the kitchen, plainly, in the way she said everything, and he sat very still for a moment with the expression of a man who has received news that is larger than he can take in all at once. Then he stood up from the table and came around it and put his arms around her very carefully, as if she had become something more precious than she was 5 minutes ago, which she had not, but she understood the impulse and let him hold her. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "Is there anything, Warren?" she said. "I am well, I am happy, this is good news." He held her for a long moment in the warm kitchen. "It is very good news," he said into her hair. She wrote to her mother in Missouri, who wrote back so quickly that the letter seemed to have traveled at the speed of maternal anxiety rather than postal service, full of instructions and affections that made Violet smile. Her mother said she was coming in spring, which Violet had been hoping for. Warren wrote to his sister in Missouri. He had not mentioned a sister before, and Violet had many questions, which he answered at length over several evenings, painting a picture of a woman named Clara who was 5 years older and had raised him considerably, their parents having died young, and who would, Warren said with the confidence of a man who knew his sister, absolutely adore Violet. The winter was hard that year but manageable. The cattle shelter Warren had built held against the cold, and Pete Haverson came through twice a week without fail, and the hay supply proved adequate, and the chimney did what Thomas had built it to do. Violet felt well through most of the winter, better than the books she had borrowed from Margaret Hale's extensive personal library had led her to expect, which Warren received as personal good fortune, as if he had somehow arranged it. In February, her mother arrived on the stage from the railhead at Abilene, a small, precise woman named Ruth, with Violet's green eyes and a quantity of luggage that suggested she intended to stay through at least the following winter. She stepped off the stage and looked at Violet, and then looked at the baby beginning to show, and embraced her daughter with a fierceness that she had always expressed love through practical action, which is where Violet had learned it. She looked at Warren for a long time. He stood and met her gaze and did not shift or posture. "Are you good to her?" Ruth asked directly, in the manner of a woman who had not come this far to be indirect. "I try to be," Warren said. "I would say you could ask her, but I expect you will ask her regardless." Ruth looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, the same nod Ellis Boone had given him 7 months ago, the same weight to it. "Good," she said. "Now, what is wrong with that chicken coop? I could see from the road that the east side is sagging." Warren and Violet looked at each other, and Violet pressed her lips together against the laugh, and Warren said, with perfect seriousness, that he had been meaning to get to it, and Ruth said that she was glad she had arrived when she did, and it was the beginning of a friendship between two people who communicated primarily through identified problems and their solutions. The child was born in June of 1884, 1 year and 1 month after their wedding, at the farmhouse in the room where Violet had slept alone through 3 weeks of grief. Ruth was there, and a midwife from Harlan named Agnes Pryor, who had delivered most of the county's children for 20 years and had strong opinions about windows and fresh air that she expressed freely throughout the proceedings. The child was a boy. He was loud and healthy and had Violet's green eyes and, Warren said, his own ears, which Violet said was too early to determine but which Ruth confirmed was probably accurate. They named him Thomas because Violet wanted to, and because Warren agreed immediately and without qualification, and because the man in the East Field had been the first person to love this land and would be the first person their son was named for. Warren held his son for the first time sitting on the edge of the bed where Violet lay, exhausted and brilliant with the exhaustion of having done the hardest thing she had yet done, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has understood something new about the size of the world and his place in it. "Thomas Warren Underwood," Warren said quietly, to the baby, who was not listening to anything except the new experience of being outside and having feelings about it. "He will be called Tom," Violet said from the pillow, "unless he decides otherwise when he is older." "He can decide whatever he likes when he is older," Warren said. "He has a good mother." Her mother stayed through the summer and into the fall, and during that time she reorganized the kitchen storage, repaired the chicken coop with Warren's assistance, became Ellis Boone's close friend in the way that practical people of similar age and inclination become close friends, and spoiled Tom Underwood comprehensively while maintaining the position that she was doing nothing of the kind. When she finally departed in October, her luggage marginally reduced because she had left several things behind as gifts, including a quilt that her own mother had made, and which she said now had the right place to live. Violet held her on the stage platform for a long time. "Come back in spring," Violet said. "I will come back for the next one," her mother said. Violet laughed. "Mother, I am not suggesting anything," her mother said innocently, and climbed onto the stage. Harlan grew that year and the next. A railroad spur was discussed and eventually built, coming through in 1885 and changing the character of the town with the speed and totality that railroads always change things. More people, more commerce, more noise, more opportunity, and more of the particular complications that come with growth. The land values shifted. Farmers who had been barely managing found themselves with properties that someone in an eastern office was suddenly interested in. And the pattern that Violet had faced alone in 1882, the pleasant man with the offer, the implication of helplessness, the suggestion that selling was the sensible thing, played out across the county in various forms. Violet, who had become something of a recognized figure in the community, not through any deliberate effort, but simply through the cumulative effect of being herself in public over several years, found herself being asked for advice. Women who came to her were mostly in situations similar to what hers had been, alone, or uncertain of their rights, or facing the smooth pressure of men who understood the law selectively. She wrote letters on their behalf. She put them in contact with Margaret Hale. She told them what she knew, which was that the law, actually consulted, was often more on their side than the men telling them otherwise wanted them to know. Warren watched all of this with the same steady attention he had given everything from the first day, and one evening when Tom was a year old and sleeping in his crib in the corner and they were sitting by the fire, he said, "You should think about formalizing what you do." She looked up from her mending. "What I do?" "The advising," he said. "You are helping these women the way you wish someone had helped you in 1882. You know the homestead law better than most men in this county. You know Margaret Hale. You have the connections." He paused. "You could make it something with a shape." She considered this. "I am a farmer's wife," she said. "You are several things," he said. "That is one of them." She thought about it for weeks. She wrote to Margaret Hale, who thought it was an excellent idea, and said that there was precedent in several eastern counties for informal legal advisory groups organized by and for women property holders, and that she would be glad to consult. She talked to Ellis, who said it was about time. She talked to her own reflection in the window glass while she was washing dishes, which was where she did some of her best thinking. In 1886, she formalized what she had been doing informally for 3 years. A property rights advisory, meeting monthly at the courthouse. Judge Alderton had offered the use of the meeting room with the benign satisfaction of a man who enjoyed being on the right side of history, where women with property questions could come, and where Violet, assisted by Margaret Hale's written guidance and occasional in-person presence, could help them understand what they actually owned and what they were actually entitled to. She called it simply the Harlan County Property Holders Group, and the name was unglamorous and accurate, which felt right. Warren came to the first meeting. He sat in the back, just as he had in the courthouse in 1882, along the wall, present and quiet and entirely on her side. And afterward he said it was one of the best things he had seen, and he said it simply, and she believed him completely. Their second child arrived in 1887. A daughter this time, fair-haired and tranquil in the way that second children sometimes are, as if they arrive already knowing the important things. They named her Ruth for Violet's mother, who arrived 3 weeks later from Missouri with her luggage and her opinions and tears in her eyes when she held her namesake for the first time, which she attributed to dust. Tom Underwood, 3 years old, had considerable thoughts about the baby and expressed them freely, mostly positive, occasionally legislative. He told Warren that the baby's ears were too small, which Warren said was an insightful observation, and he told Violet that the baby was too loud at night, which Violet said she agreed with entirely. He was a serious child with his mother's green eyes and his father's steadiness, and he moved around the property already with the proprietary attention of a person who intends to know every inch of something, which he had learned from watching both of them. The property itself had grown. Not dramatically, not through any great opportunity or stroke of luck, but through the steady accumulation of effort over years. A second field cleared and planted, the cattle herd grown to 30 head with the addition of a second bull, the barn rebuilt larger the summer before Ruth was born, with proper stalls and proper storage. The farmhouse had been expanded too. Warren and Ellis had built a second room and a proper sleeping loft the previous fall, making space for what they both acknowledged was a family that was likely to continue growing. The new room had a bookcase along one wall, built by Warren over 2 Sundays in good weather, stocked with the accumulated books of 2 readers who had been comparing notes for 5 years, and whose collection had achieved a pleasing chaos of subject and style. Tom's wooden alphabet blocks lived on the bottom shelf. Baby Ruth's rattle had rolled back there twice and been retrieved with effort. On a spring morning in 1888, Violet stood in the east field with Tom at her knee and Ruth on her hip, and watched Warren come in from the south boundary on the gray gelding, who was 7 years older than when he had first come down the main street of Harlan, but still moved with the same calm reliability. And she thought about the Tuesday in September 6 years ago, when the whole of her life had been a hammer and a deed, and 3 miles of dust, and a courthouse she was walking toward. Warren came up to the field fence and swung down from the horse and came through the gate, and Tom detached from her knee and went to his father with the decisive speed of a 3-year-old who has decided where he is going, and Warren caught him and lifted him to his shoulder in one fluid motion without breaking stride and came on to where she stood. "Fence is good," he said. "All of it." "Good," she said. He stood beside her and they looked at the field together, the way they had stood beside things together for 6 years, the way she thought they would stand beside things for as long as there was standing to be done. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at the field, at the good grass, at the creek line visible through the cottonwoods, at the house with its expanded roof and its reliable chimney, and the chicken coop that her mother had personally supervised the repair of twice now. She looked at Tom on Warren's shoulder, pointing at something in the sky with the authority of someone who has spotted a hawk. She looked at Ruth, who was looking back at her with those calm, pale eyes. "I am thinking," she said, "about a Tuesday morning when I walked into town with a hammer." He looked at her sidelong, the way he had looked at her from the boardwalk that first morning, the way she had been looked at ever since by the one person who had seen her fully from the start. "And," he said, "and I am thinking that I did not nail the deed to the door," she said. "I did not need to in the end. I had the judge and the law and Margaret Hale and the survey notes." She paused, "but I needed to be the person who would have." He was quiet for a moment. Tom had climbed down from his shoulder by the self-determined method of small children and was investigating the fence post with a seriousness it probably did not deserve. "You were that person," Warren said. "I was," she said. "And you knew it." "I saw it," he said. "The moment I saw you." She looked at him. He looked back. The field was green and gold in the spring morning, and the creek was running high with snowmelt from the north, and somewhere beyond the cottonwoods one of the cattle was making itself heard in the way cattle do when they want someone to know they exist. "I am glad you were on that boardwalk," she said. "I am glad you let me walk beside you," he said. She shifted Ruth to her other hip and leaned briefly into his shoulder, not collapsing, not in need, just touching the wall she had known was there. And he put his free arm around her, and they stood in the east field on their own land with their children and the spring morning, and everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that needed to grow was growing. And the deed was on the courthouse record, and the hammer was on the hook in the kitchen, and the man beside her had never stood anywhere else. The cottonwoods along the creek had dropped their seeds in the last week, and the air was full of the white drifts of them, lazy and brilliant in the morning light, falling over the grass and the fence posts and the good limestone chimney that Thomas had built to last, drifting across the east field where he lay, and settling on the creek water that ran clear and continuous over the smooth limestone bed, going where it was going as it had always gone, neither asking for anything nor stopping for anyone. Just running on. Tom came back from the fence post with a piece of gravel he had decided was significant. He offered it to Violet with ceremony, and she accepted it with equal ceremony and put it in her pocket, and he nodded with satisfaction and went to investigate something else, because he was 3 and the world was full of interesting things. Warren watched his son and then watched his wife, and she watched him watching, and they stood in the spring morning on their land, all the fights fought and won, all the papers filed and settled, the future opening ahead of them, the way the sky opened when you came out of the town and onto the plain suddenly, completely, like a door swung wide. There was nothing else needed. There had been a deed and a hammer and a courthouse, and a man who had fallen into step beside a woman who did not need him but found in time that she had room for him, that her life was larger with him in it. The way a room is larger when you discover it has more light than you expected. There had been a judge and a lawyer and an old man on a mule named Constance, and a boy who named a calf Biscuit, and a mother who arrived with luggage and opinions. There had been grief, and there had been courage, and there had been the specific bravery of getting up every morning and doing the work in front of you whether or not you felt equal to it. And there had been this: 2 people standing beside each other in a field that was theirs, in a morning that was theirs, with their children and their cattle and their chimney and their books, in the particular contentment of people who have built something real. The spring light moved over the grass in waves, the way light moves when the wind and the sun work together, and the cottonwood seeds drifted and settled, and the creek ran on, and in the kitchen of the farmhouse on the hook beside the door, the hammer hung with its nail still bright, waiting for nothing more, having already done the only thing it needed to do, which was to be carried firmly in the hand of a woman who knew what she was worth, on a Tuesday morning in Harlan, Texas, in the year 1882.